All right, well, welcome. We're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Agent.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Haney Keith.
Here.
Ash.
Here.
Willits. Woodings. 4 present, 2 absent.
Well, the mayor and Courtney asked me to run a tight ship today. I'm already 2 minutes late. So far we're kind of off to a rocky start, but I think we can catch up a little bit and hopefully we get the mayor and council member Willits online. We've got 4 items today on the work session, plus an executive session. First up is History of the Boise Valley People with Director of Arts and History, Jennifer Stevens.
Thank you, members of council and Mayor, if you're online. As we anticipate the events of this week, the return of the Boise Valley people, and I share some of the tribe's history and culture with you today, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people on which we are meeting today. I'm Jennifer Stevens. I'm the Director of Arts and History, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come today and talk to you a little bit about the history of the tribes and why we are celebrating this week and why the tribes are coming here. So the agenda will just be a brief introduction and a brief timeline. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who the Boise Valley people are, who the Northern Shoshone, Northern Paiute, and Bannock peoples are, and tell you a little bit about their current residential locations and the meaning of the upcoming event. So the Boise Valley people are also known as the Nuini, and I may not be pronouncing that correctly. It's a Shoshonean plural word meaning human beings or the people. They are speakers of Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute languages and can also be called Shoshonean people. These languages are all Numic languages, part of the Uzo-Aztecan language family. Language is a crucial characteristic that ties the Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute peoples together. Language remains today a very important way of being, as one Shoshone member described it. The language itself is an important component of their culture and remains alive today. Their languages are all called Numic languages, and they are part, as I mentioned, of the Uto-Aztecan language family. You can see on the graphic here, and instead of seeing the graphic, I'm seeing Councilwoman Woodings. So hopefully you can look on your own screens and identify that this particular language family extended south into Mexico and other parts of Central America. Interesting, therefore, that the people who occupied the lands we're on today share ancient language with our Central American neighbors. I do not know. Councilwoman Woodings, can you see the presentation?
I cannot see the presentation. I was just about to let Amanda know.
Okay.
I don't think that's on your end. I think it's just which screen is selected back there in the booth. So you're good, Jennifer.
I want the clock stopped and I want my time back.
Yeah. You can always appeal.
That was for Courtney's benefit. The language, of course, didn't originate as a written language, but as an oral tradition. And in recent years, Idaho State University's anthropology department has worked with the tribes to create a written language from the oral tradition. This is a way that they can help keep the language alive and thriving through the education of young people. So the Numu people, as all of these people are called, share many traits. The Shoshone, Bannock, and Paiute people means that there is some, however, overlap in tradition and subsistence ways of life. So it's important to recognize that Boise, where we sit today, is really a borderland, a mixing place of these various cultures as well as some of the languages, although we are primarily the home of Numic speaking people. Nevertheless, because we were talking about 3 groups that shared this similar language, they also share many common traits. So first, with regard to social structures, members of these groups lived in highly mobile microbands. They were very small, and that was because the lands of the Great Basin, as won't surprise you, couldn't really support large groups of people. Bands were typically no more than 20 people, comprised of family members. The nuclear family was usually the structure, and that was the primary social unit. Scholars often characterize the societies as having gender parity, interestingly, due to their specialized roles within their groups. All of those roles were critical to survival, both the men's and the women's. Neither was socially superior. So women typically gathered roots, nuts, seeds, berries, prepared all the foods, produced the clothing, built and maintained shelters, and reared the children. Men, on the other hand, hunted and defended their communities from others, as well as participating in raids on other groups. When it came to subsistence and labor systems, the bands moved frequently during all seasons except for winter. And in fact, they rarely remained in a single place for more than a week. The migrations capitalized on the availability of foods and the resources that they relied upon for survival. The resources in this region that these various tribes lived in lent themselves to small game hunting, including groundhog and rabbit, and to nut, berry, and seed gathering, as well as root digging. Some of the groups that are part of the Numic family of language speakers further to the north and to the east toward the Snake River Plain over in eastern Idaho hunted bigger game such as deer and buffalo. So a lot of it was really local dependent. In winter, the bands gathered in larger and more stationary groups, although usually no more than 50 people, so that they didn't put undue pressure on fuel and water systems. The winter groups were typically made up of 2 to 3 related families who dispersed together to favored camping spots. There were some differences among these Numic-speaking groups. Most of those came from climate and the systems that resulted from that I just mentioned. For instance, in the southern part of the Great Basin, you found Paiute people in southern Nevada who gathered pinyon seeds, what we know as pine nuts today. In eastern Idaho, as I mentioned, they hunted bison and deer. And in the Malheur region in central eastern Oregon, there were freshwater marshes. And in those places, waterfowl made up some of the diet. Still others relied on various fish species such as trout, or where they were available, salmon. So these tribes live in these places that are identified here on the slide up at the top today. They are alive and well. They are practicing their traditions. And although they were involuntarily removed to these reservations, it's critical to recognize that they remain a living, breathing culture, set of cultures, continuing to celebrate and practice their heritage and living in the communities you see here. Boise is their gathering place because the Boise Valley lies at this crossroads, the border, if you will, between the Great Basin, the Columbia River Plateau, and the Great Plains. Boise is at the intersection of, in addition to that, the Northern Paiute, the Northern Shoshone, and the Bannock people. So as I'm presenting the information today, keep that in mind as to why Boise is such a significant place for these tribes. In Idaho today, there are 5 federally recognized tribes: the Coeur d'Alene, Kootenai, and Nez Perce, all of whom reside up on the Columbia River Plateau, and then the Shoshone Bannock and the Shoshone Paiute. Today, we're going to talk about those last 2. You're going to hear this week that there are 5 groups that make up the Boise Valley people, and they are all descendants from those last 2 groups that I mentioned. Today, I'm going to talk about these groups, the Northern Shoshone, the Northern Paiute, and the Bannock, and I'll get into more details on the following slides. But roughly speaking, the Northern Shoshone occupied the territory on the upper Snake River, which is today around the Weiser Givens Hot Spring area upstream into eastern Idaho, and then all of the lands lying south of the Salmon River. The Northern Paiute, on the other hand, occupied lands in northern Nevada, so think Winnemucca and that area, and central and eastern Oregon, such as Burns. The Bannock, on the other hand, were actually originally bands of Northern Paiute. They migrated after the introduction of the horse in the 1600s eastward and eventually mixed with the Northern Shoshone in eastern Idaho. And accordingly, they are grouped together in what we call the Shoshone Bannock. Archaeology is where we get a lot of the information about the ancient civilizations that resided on this land before European contact. And this map shows some of the archaeological sites. I apologize for the poor quality of this. It's hard to reproduce some of these. But it's these archaeological sites and the artifacts that came from them that tell us and help us draw conclusions about the past and who occupied the lands. And of course, in these particular cases, we know from the artifacts that were unveiled in these places that the people who lived here before us were here for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. So again, Boise was really a borderland between these people. And because of the proximity of Great Plains and the Columbia River Plateau, the culture that you see continuing to survive here and be celebrated is sort of a hybrid of that basin, Great Basin and Columbia River Plateau culture, as well as a composite of the Great Plains and Great Basin culture. Because in those many, many thousands of years ago, there was some form of travel. People traveled on foot and some of these cultures mixed. So here, and I'll try to use the pointer, I just want to point out how some of this worked. So what you'll see on the screen here is our arrows that point to some of those migrations that occurred initially on foot by some people, but then after the horse was reintroduced in the late 1600s and into the early 1700s, these migrations varied more broadly and more frequently. So the Northern Paiute came from the Oregon and from Northern Nevada and came up this way. This is the Boise River here. And they came up this way to fish for salmon in the lower Boise River. They also traveled over to the area around Fairfield to gather roots in the Camas area. Additionally, the folks, the tribal people in eastern Idaho here, the Northern Shoshone, would travel downstream to the area below Shoshone Falls, to gather salmon as well, to fish for salmon, because Shoshone Falls was actually the barrier where the salmon could no longer naturally pass beyond that. So as you can see, the different Numic people comprised of the tribes that I'm talking about, really utilize this whole southern Idaho area and mix together frequently. So as I mentioned, the various tribes through the 2/3 tribes that we're talking about. Oops. If you use the mouse, it'll show up online too. What will show up online? Oh, great. Okay. Amanda just pointed out that for the folks online, I can now use the pointer with the mouse and show you where I'm pointing to. So apologies for the mayor and Councilwoman Woodings for not knowing that. You can see here, let's see, where am I? Okay, Northern Shoshone people. So some of the characteristics that make these people unique within the larger group of the Numu people, it's important to know that, again, they shared many characteristics, and the term Northern Shoshone is something that Europeans came up with. So as we talk about the Shoshone at large, there is the Eastern Shoshone who resided in the Wind River area in Wyoming. And then there are the Western Shoshone who resided a little bit further south of us and into Nevada. The Shoshone themselves don't recognize differences amongst themselves. So the Northern Shoshone is really a term that the anthropologists came up with after contact. But they did, in fact, like I say, occupy the areas north of Utah today and do, in fact, share social and language structure with their kin people. So you can see on this next slide, and now hopefully the folks online can see this, that the Shoshone people are the Eastern Shoshone people were here in the Wyoming Wind River area. And the Western Shoshone were down in this area, while the Northern Shoshone occupied the region in southern Idaho where we live today. This is also a good graphic to show that the Northern Paiute were over here in northern Nevada and central and eastern Oregon. Oops. Actually, let me go back to that last slide 1 second. So the Shoshone people who lived in the Boise, Payette, and Weiser River valleys, who were Northern Shoshone, occupied an environment that was, of course, favored by superior fisheries, in particular, a mild climate and good grasses. And after the horse was introduced, those grasses really provided food for the horses and allowed greater travel throughout what we now know of as Idaho. This allowed them to, in fact, travel even east to do some of the buffalo hunting before the buffalo went not extinct, but basically the populations declined so that they couldn't be used anymore for food. And they also traveled up to the Camas Prairie to dig more roots. So as that horse became an important part of their culture, there was much more travel. They did gather the salmon along the Snake River in the area downstream from Shoshone Falls and continue to traverse the range and descend into the Great Plains area for the buffalo. Most of what we know about the Northern Shoshone comes from what's known as the late period in archaeological terms, because that's really, not surprisingly, we know the most about the most recent time, right? So we know that their language was Numic, and they spoke a dialect that's considered Central Numic, as opposed to, when I'll talk about the Paiute, they spoke a Western Numic dialect. We know for certain that, based again on archaeological findings, that the Shoshone actually had arrived on the Snake River Plain and were moving north from Utah into that area by the middle of the 1400s. Their oral tradition may take them back before that. So what I'm talking about, it's important to recognize, is what scientists, white people today, have identified through artifact and through archaeological digs, which may be different than what their oral traditional tells. The Shoshone had many similarities, of course, between themselves, and a lot of the differences that you see between the different groups relied on entirely local things, right? Not on different cultural groups, not on fixed memberships in social groups, not on chiefs, anything along those lines. There's no real strict territory that can be demarcated between the Northern Shoshone and any of the other Shoshone people. But importantly, a lot of the differences that scholars identified were based on their diets. So I'm guessing that a lot of you have heard of the sheep eaters. That's one of the Northern Shoshone people that have been identified by what they ate. Well, the folks in the Boise River Valley were actually called by early contact folks, the Europeans, groundhog eaters. Other people in the Snake River Valley were called salmon eaters. But again, these weren't tribal distinctions. This is how Europeans identified different groups that were traveling throughout this area, but all really belonged to this Numic family in the Northern Shoshone. I just want to give you a little information about the belief systems and the traditions of the Shoshone. Unlike Europeans, they had very little sense of private property. So all Shoshone had rights to subsistence yielding natural resources. So nothing was really owned by an individual until the thing was taken. So if you hunted a buffalo and you took a buffalo, then that buffalo became yours. Of course, there was a great deal of sharing after that time, regardless. But in terms of the natural, the hunting grounds, the fishing grounds, those belonged to everyone in common. They had a deep belief in visions and in dreams, the efficacy of dreams. And in terms of their worldview, they had mythology that the wolf had actually created the solar system and man, and he was seen as serious and benevolent, while the coyote was considered a trickster, and that the opposition between those two animals brought disorder into the world, and that was the world that we as man occupy today. In addition to that, medicines were traditionally used to implement supernatural powers. And believe it or not, everybody in the entire tribal system could be a shaman. There was a category of specialists who could sort of gain extra special power with supernatural powers of the efficacy of these plants. But in any case, most of the people in the tribes could actually could practice medicine. And then with regard to ceremonies, some of which I imagine that you can go see this weekend, which I'll tackle at the end of this, these were mostly dance focused, and they were simple. They reflected the nomadic style of the tribes. In the spring, they held a dance to ensure the return of the salmon, and then they held another one after the salmon had arrived. They did blessings as winter arrived so that they could ensure the bounty of the season and survive through the winter and such. So I'll move on to the Northern Paiute next. A lot of this is going to sound similar, again, because they shared many traits. These people ranged across a large territory, ranging from Northeast California, around the Pyramid Lake area in Nevada, Western and Central Nevada, Central and Eastern Oregon, and Southwestern Idaho. This is also a Numu-speaking group that shared many characteristics with the Northern Shoshone. Again, from the same time period, we know the most from this particular era. And just like the Northern Shoshone, this is not a term that was used by the people themselves. This is a group that has been identified by white anthropologists or European anthropologists after the time of contact. The Northern Paiute were semi-nomadic. They relied also on the spoils of hunting, gathering, and fishing. They also occupied homes or districts in a family unit, very similar to the Northern Shoshone. They had something that they called districts, though, and the divisions within those districts was what we called tabiwa, or what they called tabiwa. That word was used to describe a resume of preferred camping spots, again, where maximal congregation could take place that could be supported by the land for their subsistence. The social structure was a little bit different, but definitely still based on the family structure. The camp group could be a little bit different. The family was a major part of that, but it contracted or expanded depending on the season. Winter camps, believe it or not, were actually less cohesive than the seasonal migrations that they had, and they were really more task-oriented. So for instance, if there was a big task like an antelope drive or other similar big hunting needs, it really wasn't necessarily done in a family unit. It was done in bigger groups. So it was a little bit less cohesive socially, but important for subsistence reasons. Politically, in terms of their structure, the Northern Paiute had senior family members that made decisions affecting the livelihood. That person would call the family together, pass a smoking pipe to senior members, and together they would come to a consensus facilitated by this headman. But unlike sort of, I think, what a lot of us believe about tribal tradition, there was not a chief system, and it was not inheritable among the Northern Paiute. So when a headman had passed away, the group came together to select a new one that was a natural leader by consensus. Again, the subsistence was really based on locale. So in southern Nevada, for instance, you see pine nut gathering, whereas in the Malheur Basin, you see a lot of waterfowl. And then finally, with regard to their belief systems for the Northern Paiute, the dreams, again, were quite powerful, and they also relied heavily on visions. You could go seek a vision in special places that were identified. A lot of times those were caves. They had a deep belief in the power of natural objects that included animals, plants, stones, water. They had a deep belief in the power of the natural world. In this particular case, both men and women could be shamans. They acquired power and strength and called upon that strength to do good in the world. That was really their role. And their ceremonies also consisted of dancing and prayer. And I'm going to end the history piece of this by talking about the Bannock people. And the Bannock people, as I mentioned earlier, were originally part of the Northern Paiutes of Eastern Oregon. And it was only after the adoption of the horse in the mid-1700s that the Paiutes traveled to the east and joined with the Northern Shoshone of the Snake River Plain. Because they were so similar in language and traditions, it was a very natural joining of people, and there's very few differences between them if you talk with them today. And so the only major, I'm sure that there are other differences if we had 3 hours to talk about this, but one of the key differences with the Bannocks is that they were, of the 3 tribes, they were actually the one that had a more rigid, and that's probably too strong a word, but a system that actually resembled somewhat of a chief system. And so they had stronger leadership norms than the other 2 tribes that we've talked about today. So finally, I want to land on what we're doing here today and why you've asked me here today to talk to you a little bit about the history. So in 2017, the city passed a proclamation recognizing the 5 tribes. And in 2019, renamed the parks that was formerly known as Quarry View Park into Eagle Rock Park, and then named the next door reserve Chief Eagle Eye Reserve. In 2019, the same year, City Council passed a resolution to value the historical and contemporary importance of the Indigenous Boise Valley tribes through sustained intergovernmental dialogues. So this year, we're honored to welcome the tribes back to Boise between June 8th and June 11th. It's the 14th year of the gathering. We'll be celebrating the tribal traditions and the tribal culture. On Thursday night, there'll be a proclamation on City Hall Plaza at 7 o'clock. And then on Friday, the mayor's office has contributed $5,000 this year to support some of the public programming that's going to be happening. And the public is welcome to go to Eagle Rock Park on Friday from 10 till 2. The rest of the weekend is private. The cultures and the tribes stay there and celebrate their culture and pass on oral traditions. But there is some opportunity for us, the public, to join them. I want to end by recommending that you visit the Arts and History Creators, Makers, and Doers, and this will be available to you. There's a link in this presentation. We commissioned, the Arts and History Department commissioned a really nice interview with 5 members of the tribe back in 2019, and it's written up in Creators, Makers, Doers, and it's called Still Indigenous, Still Here, and it talks about the return of the Boise Valley people. And so I strongly recommend that you go hear them in their own words because the interview is transcribed there. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Director Stevens. Also, just to note, we both have the mayor and council president on the call as well at this point. Any questions from council members or the mayor?
Master Mayor.
No, thank you. That's not needed.
we see this trend of more and more involvement and engagement with the tribes. It's not a fair question, but what are we planning next year?
You're right. That's not a fair question. I can tell you that we at the Department of Arts and History have been working with the mayor's office closely on determining exactly what next year looks like and what the future is going to be looking like. And I think that it's fair to say that there are many people in the organization that are deeply committed to following through on that resolution that was passed in 2019 and making sure that there is continued dialogue and celebration of the people here. I don't have specifics for you. I think that the tribes themselves have been working with other members of the community on the possibility of putting together a cultural center. I don't know what, if any, the city's role will be in that, but I know that the intent, certainly from our department, and I think through much of the rest of the organization, is to continue this dialogue and to continue to support them in any way that we can.
Yeah, I would be personally really supportive of signaling and indicating that the types of things we're doing this year, welcoming them to our space, the park, respecting privacy and distance as particularly the language is helped passed on, but also engaging the public in ways like the more we signal that that's something we do every year, or that we want to, embed that in our quote unquote culture in City Hall, I'd just be really supportive of that, because it's so easy to stop doing things. I mean, we stopped the 4th of July parade for a while, right? So anything we can do to sort of entrench this in our habits, I'm fully supportive of and would be happy to help with however I can.
Thank you, Councilmember Bajent.
Yeah, Director Stevens, I might just add, I really appreciate the presentation today. Not only do I think this is great in preparation for the Return of the Boise Valley People events that we have later this week and this weekend, but also with our once in a multi-generation zoning code update that we've got going on next week. When we think about land use and the way that we use our land, I think it's important to really go back as far as we can in that context. And so I appreciate you grounding us in some of that history. And I would encourage other council members, the general public, to do additional research as well. Because like you said, there's a 30-minute presentation is not going to cover very, very much, but it is good to recognize the indigenous people of this valley, the way that they used it, and the way that that can shape how we use it going forward. So thank you. Next up on the agenda, also with Director Stevens, is Percent for Art. And we've got about 15 minutes for this. Oh, I think we actually maybe did have one question from Council President Woodings.
Thank you. I wasn't sure whether to call you Mr. Mayor since you didn't like Master Mayor. So
if we could just do Councilmember Halliburton, that would maybe be easiest for me.
All right, Councilmember Halliburton, thank you. I just wanted to real quick shout out the Arts and History Department and all of the work that they've done throughout the years, and particularly note that turning point in 2019 where Tilly Bubb and her team really put in a lot of work. And I think our tribal community members also put in a lot of work to deepen that relationship. And it's been really great to see going forward how that's paid dividends, I think, for our relationship and how we interact going forward and how we really respect the original inhabitants of our valley. So I just wanted to give a little shout out as someone who was there at least since 2019 and really support any efforts going forward. I think that it's been a tremendous value to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President. All right, item number 2.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor and members of council. I'm here today to talk about the revisions that we are proposing to the Percent for Art ordinance. You'll see on the screen that this is a slide that you saw back in April when I was here the first time to discuss this. We did in fact come to you back in April to discuss our suggested proposed revised ordinance, and really appreciate the feedback you gave us on that night. We did at that time go back to the draft and make changes based on your feedback and suggestions. And the draft that you'll hear tonight in the first reading reflects those changes. On the screen is an excerpt of the existing ordinance, which relies entirely on formulaic calculations off of the capital improvement project spend for both the commissioning of art as well as for maintenance, project management, and educational and programming costs. The ordinance as it stands today was passed in 2001, updated in 2009, and is today 23 years old. When it was passed, the city created budgets every 2 years instead of every year. Maybe we should all remember those days fondly. When it was passed, many things have happened since that time, since the percent for art was first implemented. Several things have transpired. The city has acquired since that time more than 1,000 pieces into its collection, including the painting that sits behind you tonight, as well as, of course, sculptures that we're all familiar with. The Department of Arts and History was founded in 2008. Public art has changed significantly since that time, incorporating temporary art, performance art, writing, and other mediums. With this in mind, the opportunities today are, as you see on the screen. We would like to propose these updates to create predictable funding for cultural asset maintenance, update the procedural language to reflect the fact that we, in fact, do budgets every year now, broaden the scope of cultural investments, and align the ordinance with the department vision. The department vision, as of today, is to be a leading cultural agency recognized for fostering a sense of belonging in Boise through accessible and place-based arts and history. To do that, we are going to recommend some changes to the existing ordinance. This slide may look a little familiar because it's similar to one that I presented to you back in April. On the left side is how the current ordinance is written, and on the right is how we propose to update it. On the left, you can see that the permitted expenses for the 1% capital expenditure include public art. The language in the ordinance today suggests permanent art only. It also does not recognize the current department mission and operations. The second part of the ordinance, as was seen on the screen a minute ago, says that up to 0.4% can be additionally added through the budget process. And the permitted expenses for that 0.4% include education, project management, planning, and maintenance. What we're proposing today is to update the capital expenditure flat calculation to 1.2% and include in those permitted expenses art more broadly defined, including but not limited to performance art, temporary art, archives and artifacts, all nested, as you'll see in the language of the ordinance, the proposed ordinance, under a term called cultural assets. We also propose to be able to use those dollars to be spent on education, project management, and planning. The other really critical part of this is that we recommend taking maintenance out of the ordinance altogether. Maintenance includes a lot of things when you're talking about a collection of 1,000 pieces and a collection that continues to grow each year. On the left, we've listed what some of those things are, including documentation, record keeping, inspections, assessments, exhibit rotation, which is an important part of maintenance because you need to remove the art from the walls and give it a chance to sit in a dark place so it's not harmed by sun rays and that sort of thing. Storage, deaccession, etc. Over the past several months, the Care and Conservation team in Arts and History, primarily Elagio Larino, has been working on putting together a detailed 5-year maintenance plan so that we would have the data necessary to shift our funding model. We've worked with the budget team on this as well. And you can see on the right column that the team has assessed the entire collection and broken out the requirements for preventative maintenance into 3 categories. 1 is the annual list, 2 is the 5-year list, and 3 is the 10-year list. The costs accordingly should be more predictable, and the ordinance revision will strip these costs away from any calculation based on CIP spend and instead be caring for our assets the same way we care for all the other assets in the city. That way, in years where there is a smaller CIP spend, we are not failing to care for the assets that are in the city's portfolio. After analyzing the collection, the team calculated an average annual spend of $85,000 for preventative maintenance, and that would be required to comply with the ideal 5-year maintenance plan. So these next couple of slides use charts to show you what we're trying to do and give you a different way of understanding it. So the chart that you see on the screen right now demonstrates just how volatile the maintenance spending is based on the way that the ordinance is written right now. So you can see that it goes everything from under $50,000 annually all the way up to $400,000 in years of really high capital spend. And it's just all over the place. And this is not a great way for us to be caring for our art. And especially now that we have a really good handle on what the requirements are for the collection that we have in the city's portfolio, we can, sort of do away with this model and move towards something a little more, I think, in line with how we do the rest of the budgets in the city. So what I did was to demonstrate on this chart the change that will occur under the new ordinance. In orange, I've represented the full 1.4% that the current ordinance permits. And in blue, I've shown the reduced calculation that will occur under the revised ordinance should you choose to pass that. It takes the calculation down to 1.2%. On the next slide, I have taken the same slide or the same chart on the previous slide and added a third column in gray. And that shows the 1.2% flat calculation of the capital improvement projects under the new funding model, and then added the average annual spend for the maintenance based on, again, that 5-year maintenance plan for the overall budget. So you can see that there are some years where it would be a little more over the last 10 years and many years where it would be less as well. The idea being, of course, again, that we care for the assets regardless of the capital spend in any given year. In addition to the change in the funding model, we also have updated and continue to update our guidelines. The objectives of that are, one, to provide uniform procedures for the planning and the allocation of funds. And number two, to make sure that our documents are pointing to the correct collection management procedures, et cetera, and updating all of those things so that we are spending the money appropriately. Importantly, the funds for the, and this is true today as well, but it's spelled out more clearly in the new ordinance. The funds will be pooled in the general fund, the airport fund, and the public works fund. The default, the way that we've written the guidelines today, is that 1% will remain for public art the way it is today. And then the 2.2% will be for the other costs of running the program. The project selection process will be such that staff will submit projects for funding to the director of the department for approval. We will report on all selected projects with both city council and to the mayor. And any project, just like today, that's over 50,000 will require city council approval to begin. And finally, we will, of course, be following our plans and policy guidelines as we do today. So that does not change. So in closing, the proposed percent for art ordinance revisions include aligning expenditures with the arts and history vision, allowing for investment in history and archives, as well as public art more broadly defined, aligning the maintenance fund allocation and operations with other capital city capital asset management practices that's rooted deeply in the planning process and the 5-year maintenance plan, expanding the potential to fund changing art or historical exhibitions or performing arts programs to meet trends of art in public places, such as the Boise Airport, maintaining a strong commitment to traditional public art, and maintaining strong collections management practices and reporting requirements. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Director Stevens. And just to note, this is information only. It will appear on the first reading calendar today at tonight's evening session. And this is largely a result of a massive amount of work that's been done in the Arts and History Department, as well as engaging with council up here on 2 different occasions and with council leadership as well. That said, we're open for questions or comments.
Councilmember Halliburton.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to clarify the default. You said 1% will be for public art. The 0.2% will be for history and archives, or what's the other? Can you just expand on that just a little bit?
Sure, exactly. So if you read the language of the proposal or the proposed ordinance, the draft that's in there today, the 0.2 is, well, I should back up. The public art is now being sort of the definition has been expanded. So there are things under public art that actually could be considered, frankly, history or artifacts. The 0.2 is what we were trying to do by specifying that is make sure that nobody was concerned or nobody would think that any money is being taken out of public art. And so that's what the default is going to be, is that no change will happen. In other words, everything that's in the ordinance as it's written now and drafted in front of you is going to be funded by that 1%. So the 0.2, as it's written in today's ordinance, is part of the 0.4, and it's for education. So think about programming, right? If we have a new piece of public art and we want to have the artist come speak, for instance, the travel costs of bringing that person out, that sort of thing might be covered under the 0.2, and any other sort of educational programming. So it's that sort of thing that will have a little bit more wiggle room with that 0.2, and it won't be so dependent on the volatility of the CIP spend.
Council Pro Tem Halliburton.
Councilmember Bajent.
Thank you, Jennifer, for not being in the job very long and tackling a huge problem and solving it. I had no idea that the entire department's funding mechanism was so volatile and so up and down and difficult. And I can't imagine how you could stably or predictably do your job without losing a lot of sleep at night. And so that's a giant problem. And so thank you for jumping in, identifying it, and solving it by smoothing the volatility in those graphs we saw. My only feedback, because we talked about this a lot and I'm fully supportive, is that I noticed, and this may be already addressed in a policy somewhere, but I noticed that a lot of the maintenance and planning topics overlapped. For instance, deaccession is in maintenance, but it's also kind of planning, right? And so many things in those lists could be characterized either way. And so in the spirit of predictability and stability, if it's not already a policy that helps clarify what counts as maintenance, what counts as planning, and how to allocate those funds, just flagging that in 10 years, you could end up with the same uncertainty with, where those percentages actually get allocated. But just really fantastic job. And thank you for being such a problem solver right out of the gate.
Thank you, Councilmember Bajent.
Question or comments online? Well, once again, Director Stevens, thanks for the presentations today. Thanks for keeping us right on time. And a big thanks to all the folks in the Arts and History Department.
Thank you so much. And thank you to legal and also to my team for the great work that they did on this. And I appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item, item number 3, shared micro-mobility program update with Mobility and Public Spaces Manager, Tessa Grieger. And while we're pulling this up, I would note as well that this is also on the first reading calendar for tonight's evening session.
Council Pro Tem Halliburton, members of the council, nice to see you tonight. My name is Tessa Grieger, and I'm the Mobility and Public Spaces Manager in the city's Planning and Development Services Division. I'm also joined by our shared micromobility team, Karen Gallagher, Bree Brush, and Tyler Johnson. And we also have Hayden Harvey, who is a manager for Lime Online, who's joining us via Zoom tonight. Appreciate the opportunity to provide an update on the shared micromobility program and specifically where we are in the process as we move towards a revamped program. What is before you tonight and in the coming weeks regarding code amendments and the anticipated contract with our selected vendor, Lime. And then I'll also share a few highlights for what we expect and what we're excited about with the new program. So as background, since 2018, the city has licensed shared micromobility vendors to operate in Boise under Title III, Chapter 14 of our city code. During this time, we've licensed 3 companies, Lime, Spin, and Bird, which up until recently have operated exclusively e-scooters, each with a max of around 250 devices in Boise. Last year, with support from City Council, we made the decision to conduct an RFP process to select one company, and this was really to provide a comprehensive shared micromobility program through a contract-based approach, as many other communities have moved towards. Through this process, we have selected Lime as the preferred vendor and have since issued a notice to award a contract to them and are currently working through those details with them. So as we move forward with this new approach, we are excited about the opportunity it offers for the city to provide and manage and enforce a comprehensive shared mobility program for Boise. one that is responsive to the feedback we've heard from the public and city council, and one that helps us move closer to our city goals and what we've heard from the public and city council, and one that really helps us move closer to our goals around mobility, equity, climate, and safety. So quickly highlighting where we are in the process and what's ahead. On the agenda for your consideration tonight is the first reading of Boise City Code amendments, which are necessary for us to advance with a single provider contract for this program. Following tonight, we are targeting the June 27th City Council meeting for your consideration of the contract, which would coincide with the anticipated third reading of the code amendments. Following that, we will be working towards the program launch in mid-July, including marketing and outreach leading up to that. So as I mentioned, on City Council's agenda tonight is the first reading of Ordinance 20-23. This ordinance will repeal Title III, Chapter 14 of the Boise City Code, which is the licensing section for shared micromobility programs. And ultimately, this will enable us to move towards a contract with one company, specifically Lime in this case. And as a note, much of the code language that we will be repealing is included or will be incorporated into the contract that we are moving forward with. And then in addition to the repeal, Ordinance 20-23 further amends Title VI, Chapter 13, which relates to the operation of bicycles, e-bikes, and e-scooters to update certain definitions related to this program, for example, allowing for seated e-scooters, providing minor clarifications and grammar edits, and then renumbering the code sections where needed. As we are preparing the contract with Lime, I wanted to touch on a few aspects of the contract that you can expect to see moving forward. This will be a one-year contract with the option to renew based on our evaluation of the program and feedback that we hear from the community as well as City Council. It will include a detailed scope of service, which will reflect Lime's proposal as well as the information that we had in our RFP, while also incorporating key aspects of our current code. It will also include an implementation plan detailing the activities that will happen prior to the program launch, as well as the activities that will happen following the program launch. Another aspect of this will be the annual fees and revenue share requirements that will be a requirement of Lime to provide to the city during the contract term. And then in addition, we will be looking at other exhibits that are typical for a contract such as this. While we have had micromobility devices in Boise for years, there are several aspects of the anticipated program that will be new to what we have in operation and on the ground today, and wanted to briefly touch on a few things that we can expect for the program that we are moving forward with. So the fleet that we expect to launch will include 800 e-scooters, and this is comparable to what we've had in place for the past several years across the three vendors. In addition, there will be a minimum of 150 e-bikes, and we are working with Lime currently to explore the possibility of increasing the number of bikes, as we see this as a really big opportunity area for the city of Boise. In addition, we will have the opportunity to introduce seated e-scooters as well as adaptive devices, beginning with what's shown on the slide here, but we'll be working with the community and Lime to determine what types of devices are appropriate for our community members, with the potential to expand and refine the adaptive fleet program as we move forward during the contract. One of the goals in establishing an exclusive provider through a contract was to allow us to have more control over the deployment of devices to provide community-wide coverage for micromobility. We will have the opportunity to approve the deployment plan of devices prior to the program launch. And within that, we will be requiring a cap on devices in downtown and on Boise State's campus, and requiring that the majority of devices are then distributed beyond those zones, so that we are really looking to provide equity and coverage throughout our community. In addition, we will be requiring a certain percentage of devices to be deployed in activity centers, along transit corridors to support first and last mile connections, and then in designated equity zones in Boise. And then ultimately, we will be requiring that Lime is rebalancing the devices daily and throughout the day to ensure that we are addressing and mitigating any complaints and concerns, and then also really providing that reliable transportation option for our community members. Parking compliance is the primary concern we hear from the public. So in addition to strategies already in operation, as well as increased education, we are planning to implement mandatory parking locations in downtown where users will not only be able to, will only be able to park in those designated zones. As we move out into the neighborhoods, we will be looking to provide preferred parking zones. So these are areas that will be incentivized, really seeking to encourage riders to end those trips in those designated or preferred parking zones, and doing that with a monetary incentive, as well as having that information in the map and promoting that through education. We are also incorporating and further strengthening the requirements related to parking compliance and complaint response times. One of our goals with this program is to provide low cost and transparent pricing options for people to use shared mobility. Lime will be offering a variety of membership options, but what we're most excited about is the different discounts and incentives they have committed to providing to provide more accessible rates for our community members, to promote micromobility as a viable transportation option, and to encourage proper use of the system. Safety remains our top priority for this program, and with this new program, we are looking forward to a much more robust user safety, education, and community engagement strategy implemented by Lime, but in partnership with the city as well as our other community partners. We will continue to look at locations where slow zones would be appropriate to mitigate conflicts, and there will also be new technology features we're excited about, such as cognitive tests to prevent impaired riding and mandatory safety quizzes for riders. We view this next year as a pilot, and we are going to be really intentional about the evaluation of the program to ensure success and to identify opportunities for refinement, both during the contract period as well as moving forward. We will be requiring comprehensive reports that allow us to understand various metrics of the program, including ridership, deployment, customer service complaints and resolution, as well as safety. We are also looking to provide a public dashboard that will allow the community to have visibility into important program metrics associated with shared mobility. To recap next steps, tonight we'll start the code amendment process, and we will be working to have a contract ready for council's consideration on June 27th, gearing up for a mid-July program launch. We are also excited to be launching a shared micromobility stakeholder committee, which we anticipate meeting quarterly, with the first meeting in a couple of weeks. So this group will really be helping to provide feedback as we lead up to the program and then during the program about how things are working. So we're really excited to hear from our key stakeholders about how things are going so that we can continue to improve and ensure that we are meeting the goals for the community. And then this will also be an opportunity for us to share information about the program so that that can then be further disseminated throughout the community. Moving forward, we would be happy to provide regular program updates to keep City Council informed about the program, how it's going, and what we're hearing from the public. With that, I will stand for any questions.
Thank you for the presentation, Tessa. I missed the name of the person representative from Lime that's online, but I was going to see if they had any additional comments that they wanted to share before we opened up to questions.
Hayden Harvey, I believe, is online.
Yeah. Hayden Harvey, if you're there and if you have any other input before we open up to questions, that'd be great. If not, that's okay too.
I'm here. Just grateful to be a part of this process. I really enjoyed working with the city of Boise, and I think you guys are certainly leading in the sort of program that we'll be delivering to the city in hopefully in the coming weeks.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to be online today. I'll open it up to questions, and that can either go to Haiti or it can go to Tessa.
Councilmember Hamilton.
Councilmember Haney-Keith.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I just had more of a curiosity, I suppose, with the mandatory parking downtown. How will that be enforced?
Council Pro Tem Halliburton, Councilmember Haney-Keith, thank you for your question. So we will be, so the mandatory parking zones will be implemented through what's called geofencing. So it will be technology based. And in doing that, in providing those mandatory parking zones, the user will not be able to park their device if it's not within one of those geo-fenced zones. So that will all be technology-based that enables them to only park in those certain zones. In addition, we have other language that will be included in the contract requiring the enforcement and compliance from Lime to ensure that those devices are being deployed in appropriate areas and that they're not being parked in areas that would provide conflicts with pedestrians and so forth. In addition, our team at the city provides enforcement as well. So they're out there helping to manage the program and ensure that it's providing safe access for people in the community.
Thank you.
Other questions from council? Looks like we got something from Council President Woodings.
Yeah, thank you, Council Pro Tem Halliburton. Tessa, I have a couple of questions. One of them is, I think it's really great that we have a stakeholder subcommittee. Is there somebody from the accessibility community included in that subcommittee? Because I know that they've had a lot of concerns with especially ADA compliance with blocking sidewalks and things like that.
Council Pro Tem Halliburton, Council President Woodings, thank you for your question. Absolutely. So we have included 2 members from the city's Cross Disability Task Force who will be participating in that committee.
That is wonderful. I appreciate that news very much. And then my second question is around the way that people will use the system. I know that in some cities you can use like your Lyft app to kind of cross access mobility devices as well. Will there be any other opportunities besides just specifically having the Lime app to access Lime devices?
Council President Woodings, yes, Lime is in partnership with Uber. So that is one way in which users will be able to access the devices. So that's one really big opportunity that we see with this program. In addition, we will be working with Lime and with our partners, including Valley Regional Transit, to identify opportunities for further integration into the mobile apps that are in existence here in Boise.
That's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the answers.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I've got one. The
Go ahead.
there was a slide with the, I think they were called, I'm gonna make up a name, sit down scooters. That was referenced sit down scooter and then also referenced, there we go. So is the sit down scooter the adaptive device that's being considered, or is that separate from the seated scooter?
Council Pro Tem Halliburton, Madam Mayor, the seated scooter is separate from the adaptive devices. So those are essentially the stand-up scooters that are converted with a seat. The adaptive devices that we will be starting at the program launch is the motorized wheelchair, essentially. It's called the Pride Mobility Scooter.
The picture that we're seeing right here?
Yep, the picture on the bottom left.
All right.
In addition, Lime is testing other adaptive devices, and these are 3-wheeled scooters. So we are working with them to determine whether or not that's something that we could bring to Boise as part of this program moving forward.
And then just follow-up question. Do you have a sense of the number of the adaptive and seated scooters that will be out there, or is that subject to demand or kind of seeing how the program works with the others?
Madam Mayor, that is subject to demand. As far as the adaptive device, the way the program works is that it's an on-demand model. So the device will be delivered to the community member upon request. And then that device is available to them to use at no charge to that community member. The initial fleet will likely include 1 or 2 of those devices. And then depending on demand, we will be working with Lime to determine if there's additional need for a fleet expansion. As far as the seated scooters, what we are currently looking at, and these details are still being worked out with the contract negotiations, but what we are looking at there is providing a very small fleet in order for our team and our partners to test those devices out. They are in use in other communities around the country. However, we want to really understand how they work here and if that's something that would be a benefit to our community. And then depending on how that process goes, we will have the opportunity to request that a certain percentage of the devices are converted to seated scooters.
I think that's all the questions. I just want to thank staff again for all the work that's been done on this. I think this is one of those situations where you're trying to make policy catch up with technology and trying to figure out some of these things as we go. And I think it's really exciting that we're kind of working our way towards, finding something that really serves our city really well. I think I saved your team from one extra work session at some point. But I do think it would be great at some point to get more information back after this has been implemented for a while to see how things are going, to make sure that this felt like a really good move. And I think it's just exciting that we're trying to move in a direction that's still getting these in our city, but getting them done in a way that serves our community better. So thanks for all the work that went into this.
Thank you.
All right, with that, I think that takes us to item number 4, downtown Boise construction update with Economic Development Advisor, Andrea Cantor.
All right. Madam Mayor and members of council, thanks for the time today. I'm Andrea Cantor and I'm the Economic Development Advisor in the Mayor's Office. I'm here to provide both an update on construction projects in downtown with a focus on the Main and Grove area between 10th and 11th. And we will also present some high-level ideas for consideration around mitigating impacts related to construction in areas similar to this in the future. At the end of this presentation, I will be kind of seeking direction from council if they're interested in some or all of the ideas presented. With your direction, we could initiate more concrete discussions with the needed internal departments and agency partners to move this work forward. I've had some initial conversations with the planning staff, and this would be a project that would likely live within that department. I want to note that while I'll be focusing the conversation on downtown, the approaches we'll discuss later in the presentation could apply anywhere in the city as needed. So over the past 8 months, this has been an economic development project due to the need to communicate and coordinate with key stakeholders and partners. I've collaborated with an array of key stakeholders from business owners to general contractors and heard a range of concerns about the number of construction-related closures and how these have impacted our residents' ability to move through the city. The photos on this slide are from the 11th Street area, just as an example of what you might experience at the street level. For background, as you are all aware, over the past few years, Boise has been fortunate to attract new investments that want to contribute to our vibrant city. Surface lots previously used for parking are being replaced by new developments. With these changes in land use, we are becoming a more dense urban city. With that, staff and key partners have identified that there's an opportunity and a need to improve communication, coordination, and decision-making around closures associated with larger complex projects in order to keep the city accessible for those wanting to bike, walk, stroll, and drive through our city, all while supporting public and private investment, which is also important. This brings us today with the number of projects currently being built. Business owners, employees, and visitors have shared difficulties with access to this area of the city, resulting in wanting to see the city take action. The key concerns that we've heard were around lack of parking for both employees and customers. Again, with these surface lots kind of going away, parking is at a premium. We were also seeing contractors utilizing metered parking, making it even more difficult. We also heard that limited access for customers and employees to be able to get to ground level businesses due to sidewalk closures or detour routes has been hard. We heard that traffic congestion due to lane closures and street closures is a concern, and also just frustration about the total number of projects being built at the same time. Here's a visual just to illustrate the closures and projects around the 11th Street area. The graphic on the left, the different colored lines, is showing various approved closures that ACHD is tracking, which range from sidewalk closures to full street closures of the right-of-way. As you can see, there's a lot going on. Then the box on the right, there are just a few examples of what's being built. We have a few hotels, a couple mixed-use housing projects, utility work, and 2 major streetscape improvements. Once completed, these investments are going to be impactful and important additions. And while many folks are excited about the future, there's some anxiety about getting through the present. If we want to prevent scenarios where entire sections of the city are closed going forward, we'll need to look at some new approaches, both internally and with some of our partners like ACHD, to address this as we become a larger city. As we look to make changes, timing of the actions are going to be important. Here is an oversimplified timeline to help highlight the process flow for a large development. We know that impacts are felt once a project is under construction and things are actually being built. So in order to have influence and reduce impacts experienced during the construction stage, changes will need to be built into the planning stages as represented by the dark blue boxes on the left. From conversations with the planning team, the planning stages, again, as represented in the dark blue boxes, is where the city is best positioned to intervene because this is where we could add conditions of approval or set guidelines early on for large projects. So developers and contractors can plan for any additional requirements into their building timeframes. To tie this back to the previous slide, the reference projects are already in this building phase, as represented by the light blue boxes here, meaning the projects have already been approved. And so we have kind of limited input in how we can be involved at this point. Excuse me. Let me just adjust. Okay. So as we look to make changes, excuse me, I did that. Again, with many of the projects in the 11th Street area already in the building phase, the current role of the city has been mainly focused on convening and enhancing communication and awareness about what's going on in this area of the city. With help from the DBA, we met with around 20 business owners with businesses within the area to understand how we could help. From the various meetings, we heard from stakeholders that they felt the city needed to address the lack of parking for customers and employees immediately, with this being within the city's authority. With support from council leadership, we worked with parking services to make some quick changes to parking to try to alleviate some of the pressure. For customer parking, we looked at time parking in the 11th and Grove area and made some adjustments to some of the parking zones from 4 hours to 2 hours. We also did some goodwill kind of conversations with contractors and project managers to help relay the concerns from business owners and ask them to work with their teams to address some of those concerns and also work to ask contractors to park elsewhere and relieve some of the meters. We also had to kind of increase enforcement of parking in these areas, again, to kind of help with that turnover. On the other side of things, to help address the need for employee parking, again, with surface lots kind of no longer available and garages being in high demand, we created a new e-permit for the west area of downtown. This is a monthly permit that costs around $25 a month. This has been well received and appreciated by employees, allowing them to be able to park near their businesses. The permit area has already had to be expanded due to demand, and I believe we currently have around 85 permit holders. So while we were able to make some changes to support employees and customers in the past few months, there's more we wish we could do, which takes us kind of to the next slides around some strategies to prepare for the future. As we talk about mitigation, the intent is to have a predictable process that helps support development and members of the community. The main focus around these actions are enhanced communication, as we see as this something the city could lead on. The ways I'm going to kind of talk about this are in a few buckets. The first ones will be around communication tools. Again, kind of focusing on how we enhance, how we communicate both with partners and the community about projects. And then I'll go into one a little more policy level focused. And then give an example of what this could look like. So under the umbrella of communication tools, the approach here is to identify how the city and or applicants could better communicate with the community. This could look like suggesting pre-construction meetings with businesses around the job site, asking partners to host ongoing meetings to share updates, or even encouraging just project websites that project managers update regularly. With the long build times, anywhere from 28 to 36 months, this could help raise awareness and provide helpful information around active zones to help members of the community plan and prepare for the different stages of development and limit some surprises. Likely, this would be a recommendation and not a requirement, and the city's role could be to support this action. Here we have the approach focused on collaborating with other agencies and organizations to enhance the sharing of information around projects at different stages. These actions could help to provide insights on what to expect for upcoming work, closures, or detours to provide a more holistic view of what to expect from a project or maybe multiple projects. On the slide, I mentioned traffic control plans. Here I'm referencing a plan that could help address how to efficiently and safely move people around a project, especially if there will be closures that disrupt the public use of the road, the sidewalks, alleys, or bike lanes. And a traffic control plan could be templated or maybe even tailored for specific project needs. Bigger picture, if we want to do more than improve just how we communicate around projects, we could look to evaluate what current policies and procedures are in place and identify where there could be opportunities for changes. Additionally, it would be helpful to identify best practices for construction mitigation based on other urban cities to help Boise find a right size solution. For this approach, we would want this to be explored at a leadership level, since we'd be asking our agency partners like ACHD to collaborate and work with us if we wanted to consider any policy changes. An example of what could come out of coordinating policies with partners like ACHD could look like working in coordination to create special traffic control requirements for larger projects. This could have elements around time limits for lane or sidewalk closures, requiring parking plans for contractors, and even ways to maintain pedestrian access throughout a project. Well, there's some things the city can do alone to address mitigation, like adding conditions to a project during the design phase or improving communication. We feel in order to have the most meaningful impact, we would want to make changes in coordination with the agency partners. We feel like the present is a good time to explore this. This kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. So with that, just seeking some direction and feedback from council. And I think staff would be ready to work on one or any of these approaches if desired. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It does say information only on the agenda, but I think everyone heard that staff is asking for direction from council. So direction would be appreciated.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Halliburton.
Councilmember Halliburton.
Councilmember Agent.
Two thoughts. I guess the first is interagency coordination is probably, in my mind, the most important, because the agencies, they are the public, right? They are the local government. So we really have a duty to minimize how much harm we're inflicting. And so to the extent that we coordinate with each other and make things efficient, that makes sense to me. On the private development, somebody, revitalizing a private building or doing private work, that's in my mind, it's not even direction. This is just my thoughts. That's a closer, tougher call. Those are public streets. To the extent that the private development improves downtown, it benefits everyone. There's a cost. Adding a lot of regulatory work to it to try to minimize impacts or whatever will result in delay, which will make some of the pain longer. So there's a sticky wicket there to unravel. And then my third thought, and this is just more of a question, and it's not, I'm not being confrontational or saying that downtown businesses are wrong, but it's not obvious to me that prioritizing employee parking is the highest and best use of limited parking downtown. We should be prioritizing customer parking, citizen parking, downtown use parking. It's convenient to be able to drive and park next to your work, but that's a space that everybody uses. And so I'm not saying, no, this is a bad idea, but we're going to tend to hear from the employees who want to park. We're not going to tend to hear from the people who go downtown to eat or the people who go downtown to walk around, even though they have as much right or more right to be parking and using that space. So flagging that balance as one that we may not get the right kind of feedback on, because the voices most incentivized and most able to be here only come from one perspective. So not sure about prioritizing employee parking downtown when downtown is a space where we want people to come and use so it remains vibrant. Not sure that adding a process that could result in delay actually solves pain downtown. The longer these go on, the worse they are. And then very sure that interagency cooperation is really important. And I actually do feel we have a real duty to try to do that.
Thank you for that.
Councilmember Halliburton.
Councilmember Haney Keith, and I think we have Council President Woodings after that.
Thank you. This is a really helpful presentation. I guess I'm just thinking out loud a little bit. I saw on your slides a focus on communication. I think I saw a little bit even on website, potentially construction related websites. I mean, one thing that I personally have found helpful, but again, it's because we're providing some fundings to support that, right? As CCDC sends out notifications on construction updates. And obviously you have to opt into those updates, but I have found those really helpful. And I don't know whether I would consistently go to a website or not, but I do think some of those types of communications to the public have been very helpful for me to know exactly kind of what stage a particular project is in and how that's going to impact your commute or where you might park. So I don't know if you've thought along those lines or whether that construction website is something of what you were thinking about. And I realize with the private development and how much the city may be involved in some of that, maybe that's more challenging to do. But, we require, at least when we're providing funding on projects for CCDC, that we're sending updates to the community. So I do like that approach. I guess my other thought, I think along with Councilmember Bajent's comments on the private development part, is also a lot of additional regulation on those private developers may be more challenging. So I guess I'm leaning more to what is it that the city can do within its bandwidth that doesn't also kind of slow things down. I noticed on one of your slides, you mentioned about time limits, for example, of like lane closures and things like that. I would personally love that, I think, in part to know that, things must be done within a particular time frame. I have heard some complaints that construction has seemed to stop, at least from the, a general member's purview, and it just stops, but the lane closure has still happened. So maybe something along those lines might be valuable, though I can understand that there may be some legitimate reasons for why a lane is closed for a longer period of time. But I definitely can have been hearing that from folks coming down Idaho in particular right now. So those are my thoughts at the moment.
Thank you for that. I think that's very helpful. And just to share a little background on some of the conversations I've had with some of the project managers and general contractors, in addition to CCDC, I think there is a willingness from some of our partners that may already be sharing some of these updates around project websites. So probably building into, maybe it's a suggestion and not a requirement if they have the bandwidth and the willingness to. We spoke with, for example, McIlvain, who said that's something that it's mutually beneficial for them to share some of these updates with businesses versus having one-on-one conversations or having some upset residents not knowing what's happening. So I think further conversations around that, but I do think there's probably some willingness from a few of the partners to share some version of information around their projects.
Council President Woodings.
Thank you, Pro Tem Halliburton. And thank you, Andrea, for really connecting with folks and getting out there and being proactive. As the liaison to Downtown Boise Association, I've been hearing a lot about some of these closures, and I think that I'm going to disagree with my fellow council members a little bit. I think it would behoove us to look at what other cities do and what best practices are when it comes to managing construction vehicles in downtown areas. For example, when St. Luke's was under construction, we required them to have a parking plan for construction vehicles to minimize impacts to the neighborhood. And we've had a couple of different instances, not just this one on the west end of downtown, but also when there was a lot of construction happening in the Live district around construction vehicles clogging up customer parking. And I think, you know, similar to employee parking, those spots should not be used by long-term parking with the citations just being kind of the cost of business. They should be required to have a plan for construction vehicles and where they're going to put them short-term, whether that's in a parking garage or whether they make other arrangements for carpooling and other mitigation strategies. So I would actually really encourage that as we go forward for our downtown. And then also on the sidewalk closures, I think we have a really famous example right near City Hall where we had a sidewalk that was closed for a very long time and really caused some harm to the businesses down there and made it impassable for pedestrians for the long term. And I think that there are some ways that that can be mitigated as well, whether the sidewalk is rerouted into the street and we lose a little bit of on-street parking. But I think that that really needs to be prioritized, is maintaining pedestrian access, whether that's a time limit for being able to have a closure on the sidewalk or rerouting the sidewalk when needed. So I really appreciate all your work, Andrea, and I'm looking forward to working with you on making sure that we have a solution that works for everyone.
Thank you, Council President.
Madam Mayor, it looks like you're up.
Yeah, thank you. A couple things. I want to thank Andrea as well and the team at DBA and Council President, your involvement on this. And I think the ACHD is there tonight too. I appreciate that they're working with our team to try to come up with some solutions. You know, this has been, I think that I'd say that map that Andrea put up on the screen with all the colors of where projects have been approved in this area is such a great example of the impact that the businesses in this part of town are feeling as we grow. And it's been really tough on quite a few of them for quite a bit of time. And the more that we can do to streamline the process, to really expect construction crews and others to mitigate the impacts they have. And from our perspective, to do things as efficiently as possible rather than to expand out the time frame of these closures, the better off our businesses will be, and the better off, frankly, our pedestrians and others downtown will be too. So we've learned a lot in this. As our city has grown, the council president's right, we ought to be looking at other larger cities to see how they do this, because this is not something that Boise's historically had to worry about as we've kind of developed piece by piece. Now we're seeing in this one area in particular quite a bit of development, which when we get through it, these businesses, I'm sure, will really enjoy the added number of people that this development brings. But until then, we got to do everything we can to help them keep their doors open. And importantly, to make sure that we have plans in place to prevent this in the future. So appreciate all the work that's being done.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I did have a couple of questions. One, you had mentioned some concerns about traffic congestion in time with some of the lane closures. I'm curious to know if we have any data that shows how bad that's been, or if that has been an actual thing, or if it's more of something that feels like that there's traffic congestion, or if there actually is documented.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something we could look into and maybe a follow-up action. I think we've heard anecdotally that as we move from 3 lanes on Main to 1, as people are coming into work, say at 9 a.m., it's very difficult. So I think some of the feedback has been around how people are feeling the traffic as they access the city. But we can see if there's some data to really show how bad it's really been.
Yeah, I always find that very interesting, just because then it kind of informs you for future street use decisions on how big of an impact some of those closures might really have. I think you got some direction from staff. I think that there's definitely a lot of support that we heard from working with our partner agencies to make sure that we do those things really well. I really think that the standardized traffic control plans and making sure that people know what the expectations are there are really, really important. And I know I'm going to sound like a Johnny come lately when I say this, but I also think that there's a role potentially that the city can play as a convener with some of our businesses that have ample parking. I'm sure this has been talked about and considered many times before, but there is so much surface level parking throughout the city that never is being used. And I think of the Albertsons parking lot, for example, and opportunities to park there that oftentimes don't happen. And I do think that there's a potential role for the city to be a convener and kind of finding some of those potential spots and figuring out how that might be able to be a win-win for everyone. I know that's a much more complicated issue, but something to be worth considering. Anything else from council? I think that's it.
Great, thank you.
Jeff. With that, that is our last regular item. So looking for a motion to move to executive session.
Councilmember Halliburton.
Good. Councilmember Bajent.
Mr. Mayor, sorry. I move pursuant to Idaho Code 722061C to enter executive session to consider the acquisition of real property not owned by a public agency.
Second.
Clerk, we call the roll?
Agent,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Haney Keith,
Yes.
Nash,
Yes.
Whittings,
Yes.
all in favor, motion carries.
All right. See everybody in a bit.